Let's talk about my favorite thing in the entire world, our Holy Torah. Most people know that when Moses went up to Mount Sinai, he came down with 2 stone tablets upon which were inscribed the 10 Commandments. Most people also know that Moses wrote the 5 books of Moses, but what they don't know is that he wrote those 5 books of Moses shortly before his death. That's right before the Jewish people entered the land of Israel. That's 40 years in the desert. What were the Jewish people learning for 40 years if they only had the 10 Commandments written down? The answer is that Moses received a lot of information on Mount Sinai, and he transmitted it to the people orally. There was so much information for the people to learn. And in fact, people had a lot of questions, and they came to him and they were asking him and asking him and asking him. And Jethro told him, "This is a lot for you." He said, "You're going to get exhausted. So why don't you appoint leaders over the people who can teach them and guide them?" So that's what the Jewish people did, and they sat and they learned with the rabbis for 40 years in the desert. Right before Moses' death, Moses sat down and he wrote the entire Torah aside from the last 8 verses which were completed by Joshua, and he gave it to the Jewish people. Now what he did was very interesting. Inside of the Torah, he didn't write all the minute details for each commandment. He wrote headlines so that when the Jewish people would read the Torah, their minds would be triggered and they would remember all the minute details that they had already learned. It's so important to have all of these details in order to correctly serve God. But they're not included inside of the Torah. You can open up to any commandment and you'll find that there's just a lot of detail missing. Our relationship with God is so dependent on correctly serving Him. Obviously, we have to have access to those details. That's where the oral tradition comes in. We have the tradition of how to understand what those headlines mean. We have the tradition of what each minute detail of each mitzvah, of each commandment actually is. Over in Deuteronomy chapter 17, it says that if a matter is hidden from you and you don't know how to understand something, your job is to go to the Levite, to the priest, or to the judge in those days, and you're to inquire of him. That means you're supposed to inquire of a rabbi. Why would you inquire of them? Why? Because rabbis have dedicated their entire life to sitting and learning Torah, and they have more information. They know all these minute details, or at least many of them. Here's a question I want you to ask yourself. Why would the Torah tell us that we have to inquire of these rabbis if anybody could just randomly open up the Bible and they would be greeted with all the information that they need? If we have absolutely all of the information that we need inside of the Torah very clearly laid out that we can just open it up and we can read it for ourselves, how could anything be hidden? It should be very obvious how we're supposed to observe the commandments. The only answer is that this oral tradition gives us the information of how to truly understand what is written inside of the Torah, and that without it, we simply can't observe the commandments correctly. I'm going to give you some examples in the coming videos that illustrate exactly why we have to have an oral tradition. We have to have more information. So stay tuned, it's going to be really interesting.